Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good day, everyone. I am Lady Trialdi in basic macroeconomics class. Having understood the main concern in macroeconomics, now I would like to explain about the indicators and their measurements. After watching this video, hopefully you can measure and evaluate the indicators. The following three indicators that we will discuss, as we know, are the main concerns of macroeconomics. Economic growth basically measures the growth of economic output. However, it doesn't make sense if we just add up the quantity of all different goods and services in the economy. How can we add apple and orange, for instance? That is why we need information about their values instead. We can add the value of apple and orange, can we? Comparing the significance of each output to the economy now is also possible. And for this reason, we will get acquainted with the concept of GDP or gross domestic product and its growth. But please keep in mind that at the end, our concern is to find the growth of output. Thus, we'll be discussing way to find the growth from the results of our GDP calculations. Similar to economic growth calculation, inflation rate cannot be obtained from adding up the prices of all commodities. We cannot add, again, for instance, price of orange and price of apple. So the information we need is also the value of the commodities. The measurement of inflation is carried out using the index number and the GDP deflators, which we will discuss shortly. Only the employment rate measurement that is more straightforward. We don't need any special calculation techniques here. The main important thing to do the calculation is the correct identification of the data. Okay, GDP is defined as follows in MenQ textbook. We can understand from each of the phrases which kind of output that are taken into account in calculating the GDP. GDP calculates all goods and services that have market value or are traded, legal, and final or for final consumption. Thus, the output produced for self-consumption, for instance, output in a black market, and output used as input for subsequent production activities are not taken into account in GDP. GDP also only calculates the goods and services produced in a specific period of time in a country, usually a year or a quarter. Therefore, used good or goods produced in the past periods are not taken into account. The output produced by citizens themselves is not taken into account if it is produced abroad. Conversely, the output produced by foreigners but in domestic economy will be included in GDP. GDP measurement can be done through three approaches. The first approach is the expenditure approach, and its components are consumption, investment, government spending, and the difference between export and imports. This approach can be used because with the circular flow logic, we know that the value of goods and services produced and traded in an economy will be equal to the value of total expenditure made by all the agents in the economy. There are, however, some things from the expenditure elements that we need to carefully understand. First is the distinction between consumption and investment. It is seen from the use value of the purchase, whether it is for the present or for the future. Therefore, the purchase of a new home, for instance, whose use value will still increase in the future, either through sales or rent, is categorized as an investment, not consumption. The same is true with the inventory of a firm. Inventory, as you know, is the unsold final output. It is also categorized as an investment and thus included in current GDP calculation because the inventory can be sold at a later date. The use value is for the future for sure. By keeping the inventory, it is as though that the inventory was bought by the firm itself. But be careful when the inventory is sold in a specific time in the future. The sales of the inventory will be excluded from the GDP because the selling value has been calculated right now. In that future GDP calculation, Current inventory is like an output produced in the past. Another thing about investment too is that we exclude the purchase of stocks, bonds, and other securities. GDP doesn't consider them an investment because the transaction does not produce any goods and services in the economy. Please remember again the definition of GDP we discussed earlier. So for the same reason, transfer payment is not part of the government spending either in GDP. It is excluded from the GDP calculation since there is no resulting output from the transaction. Finally, exports are added in the calculation of GDP because they are the value of output produced domestically. On the other hand, imports are subtracted from GDP because they are consumed domestically, yes, but produced outside of the domestic economy. The second approach to calculating GDP is through the income approach. This approach can also be used considering the income and expenses of all economic agents are the same, again from the circular flow logic. Expenditure for one economic agent will become income for another economic agent. However, we cannot simply add all the personal income of all production factors in the economy. Please always remember the definition of GDP. It is about the value of goods and services produced in an economy. So pay attention to the following GDP calculation when using income approach. Here is the GDP when we break it down until we get personal and disposable personal income. From personal income to GDP, however, we need to reverse the process and the sign. Just like with the expenditure approach, some value adjustments needs to be made. Individual income from transfer payment, for instance, which apparently is included in personal income, must be excluded from the GDP calculation because the transaction does not produce any output. On the other hand, the value of depreciation, indirect taxes, or company profits are all reflected in the final value of the economic output, but not part of the personal income. Therefore, to get the correct GDP value, these values must be added to the total personal income. Moreover, domestic citizens may also earn income from their work abroad, thereby increasing total personal income. In order to get the correct GDP value, this kind of income also must be deducted from personal income because they are not earning the income from producing output in domestic economy. Conversely, foreign factor income that is not part of domestic personal income actually must be added in a GDP calculation if they earn their income from producing output in domestic economy. The last approach is called the production approach. GDP, well, is basically calculated to find this value of production. The calculation using this approach can be done in two ways. First is by adding up all the value added of output produced by all production sectors in the economy. Why using the value added? Remember, in an economy, the output of one sector, if not consumed, will be used as an input for other sectors. Therefore, the value of output of the former sector must be excluded from the value of output of the later sectors that use the former sector's output as their input of production. It is to avoid the so-called double counting problem. Another way to calculate GDP using the production approach is by adding up the total sales of all final products with changes in inventory value. Final product means a product that ends up at consumption, not becomes an input of the subsequent production process anymore. Meanwhile, the addition of changes in inventory is intended to eliminate double counting from calculation of GDP in the past. Remember when I explained about treating inventory in expenditure approach earlier? Positive change in inventory means that there are unsold products in current economy. They are produced currently and they are treated as investment of the respective firm in our former expenditure approach. Since the inventory is not used as an input of production, it is also categorized as a final product. On the other hand, the value of changes in inventory becomes negative, or deducting the current GDP value if the inventory or the unsold products in the past is sold in the current periods. It is simply because the sale is not on currently produced output, and the inventory value is already counted in the past calculation of the GDP. After knowing the measurement of GDP, we now return to our main intention of calculating the GDP, that is to calculate the economic growth. GDP is usually measured in current prices and constant prices. The difference in the calculations of the two can be seen clearly here. The GDP values differ due to the differences in this price component. At the very beginning, I already said that the economic growth is basically a measurement of output growth. That is why economic growth must be calculated using GDP with constant price or real GDP, so that the changes that occur will reflect only changes in output. This is how the growth is calculated using the real GDP. Furthermore, we have the so-called GDP deflators, which is the ratio of nominal GDP to real GDP like this. And it is often used as a measure to calculate inflation in the economy, as we will discuss later. So when we calculate the growth of nominal GDP, it actually will be a summation of the inflation rate and economic growth rate, not economic growth rate alone. So from our discussion of GDP calculation approach and economic growth, the use of GDP can measure the followings. In addition, GDP is also an indirect measure of economic welfare, but of course, GDP is not a perfect indicator to measure the level of welfare. Much of the quality of life like this are not reflected in GDP. However, it is worth noting that a country with a high GDP is more likely to get such quality of life as better education, cleaner environment, or more adequate health services. Many of the quality of life indicators evidently have positive correlation with GDP as shown in the textbook. Okay, let's now talk about measuring inflation. By definition, inflation is an increase in the overall price level in the economy. One of the most important things we can get from measuring inflation is to know the purchasing power of our money, income, wage, or loan deposits in an economy. Based on the information, firms and workers can agree, for instance, on the working contract. Or the inflation information may also be used when people is about to borrow or lend funds, or firms may use it as well when they are setting price of their products. The opposite of inflation is deflation, or a decrease in the overall price level. But please don't mess it up with disinflation, because disinflation is not a decrease in prices, but it is a decrease in the inflation rate. So the overall price level in an economy may continue to rise even during the disinflation period. Measuring inflation, like measuring GDP, uses data of value of goods and services in the economy. We cannot simply add prices of orange and apple, remember? The two most frequently used indicators for calculating inflation are the CPI or Consumer Price Index and the GDP deflators. The process for computing the CPI is as follows. First, we need to survey consumers to determine the basket of goods and services as well as their prices. Basket of goods and services in the CPI calculation is all goods and services consumed in the economy. For comparison, in calculating GDP deflator, the basket is all goods and services produced and measured in the GDP calculation. The next thing is to compute the basket's cost. The CPI basket is fixed, and unlike the basket in the calculation of GDP deflator that varies following the change of commodities produced in the economy. Once the basket of CPI contains 5 apples and 2 oranges, for instance, so in every CPI calculation, the basket will always contain 5 apples and 2 oranges. After computing the basket cost, we choose the base year to compute the index. Well, CPI is simply the ratio of the basket cost for a specific year and for the base year. Look here, the baskets are the same, baskets of commodities set in base year. After obtaining the CPI figures for different years, we can finally calculate the inflation rate. Inflation rate is just the growth of CPI. Apart from the different use of baskets and accordingly the different weight of each commodity, CPI and GDP deflators also differ in their treatments on imported goods and capital goods. Imported goods are consumed domestically, hence they are calculated in the CPI. However, since imports are excluded from the GDP calculation, imported goods are also excluded in the GDP deflator basket. On the contrary, capital goods are included in the GDP deflators, but it is excluded in the CPI since capital expenditure are in the investment category, not consumption. Because of these differences, CPI and GDP deflator will be different in calculating inflation if there is a significant change in price of imported goods or price of capital goods. Computing inflation, furthermore, using the CPI can also overstate the true inflation rate, and it is mainly due to the fixed basket in CPI. Consumers may actually have substituted expensive goods for cheaper goods, but with fixed basket, the expensive goods are still included in the CPI basket with the same quantity. The value of money can also be higher due to the entry of new goods or changes in the quality of goods, but CPI cannot take into account the change. As a result, the CPI may overstate the cost of living. The calculation of unemployment rate is more straightforward. We know the term population in an economy, and part of the population who are able to work or age 15 years and older is called manpower. From the manpower figure, then the labor participation rate can be calculated. That is the percentage of labor who enter the labor force. Labor force consists of those manpower who are ready to work. However, not all the labor force can work. Some of them are unemployed. So by definition, unemployment is the labor force that is not working, but is looking for a job or preparing for a business or feeling desperately to get a job or has been accepted for work but has not started work. The unemployment rate itself is then formulated as the percentage of the unemployed labor force. Okay, so that's all my brief explanation about macroeconomic indicators and their measurements at the moment. Thank you for your attention and see you again in other videos with different basic macroeconomics topics. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.